Today, we're going to be going over how to change a tyre on a Xiaomi electric scooter. Now, this process is going to work for the standard model, the Pro, the Essential, basically any Xiaomi model, this process is going to help you out. Now, Xiaomi tyres can be tricky to change, and I've done hundreds, so I know this process. If you stick to our 4-step guide, you're going to have a good chance of succeeding. The tools you'll need are a 2.5mm Allen key, a pick or a sharp knife, an 18mm spanner, a T20 security tool, a hammer, a pair of pliers, some tyre levers, some mole grips or a plumber's wrench, some zip ties, and your spare inner tube. Before we start, I've lifted my Xiaomi up on a block. This lifts the wheels off the table and stops it from falling over on me while I'm working. Our first step is going to be to remove the front wheel, so let's get started with that. We're going to remove these stickers and show you reflectors. You get a sharp knife under the corner. If you damage these, replacements can be bought online pretty cheaply. Just do the other side as well, same process. Next, we're going to need to remove the 6 2.5mm Allen key bolts, which are holding these covers on the side of the forks. On the right side of the scooter, there's 4 bolts, and on the left, there's 2 more. Now that the covers are off, we need to remove the rest of the 2.5mm Allen key bolts. This one has 2 on each side. If you have an older scooter, you may find that's more. Keep these separate from the other ones, as these are slightly shorter. Just move on to the other side. Next, we're going to pull the plastic cover away from the fork and insert our 18mm spanner. It's best here to avoid using an adjustable spanner because those can slip on the nuts and damage them. These bolts can be quite tight, so a nice long spanner is a good idea as well. Now that this one's loose, I'm going to move on to the other side and do exactly the same. As you can see, these things are pretty tight. Take your time. And if you feel the spanner slipping, stop and start again. Now that the bolts are loose, I'll do the final bits with my fingers. On the drive side one, it's obviously held on by the motor cable. Now that we're loose, the wheel should drop out. Now we'll move on to step number 2, and we're going to start by removing the anti-spin washers from the axle. It's a good idea to note that these fit on the inside of the fork with the little notch facing outwards. Next, I'm going to flip the wheel over and begin the process of removing the motor. Using your T20 bit, we're going to loosen all 6 motor bolts. Now we need to flip the wheel over because we're going to use our hammer to knock this axle through. Now, while you're doing this, be careful not to pull on this cable because you don't want to damage your motor cable. So, taking our hammer, we'll give the axle a gentle hit. So you hear that. And you'll see now we have a slight gap between the motor cover and the wheel itself. We now need to move the scooter onto the floor, so I would recommend popping the motor onto the deck, again being careful not to damage the motor cable, and we can go. Now that we're down here, I'm going to move the motor onto the floor with the cover facing upwards, and we're going to press onto the tyre section to free the motor. And be careful here because the magnets will pull very tightly back, so I'm going to use my knees to hold it down while I pull the motor free. There we go. I've now put the scooter off to one side and we can move on to step 3. So the first thing here is going to be to remove the valve cap. and with a small tool or Swiss Army knife, you can pop this little washer free. The next step is going to be to deflate the tyre fully. We need to go all the way down on this because any air left inside is going to make it really difficult to remove the tyre. So if you press on the valve, you should be able to squeeze all of the air out of your tyre. These tyres are quite stiff. So that's completely flat now. Now we're going to move on to the really tricky bit. You're going to need your pipe or mole grips. You're going to need 2 of either. And you can see I've taped around the ends to stop them from damaging the tyre when we use them. The aim here is to squeeze the tyre together and then place your clamps on the tyre. What this achieves is to squeeze the 2 beads together so they'll sit nice and deeply in the rim, and that will give us a slack on the opposite side that we can push this through. If you're using your pipe grips, this is where you'll need a zip tie to hold them closed as they don't clamp shut like the mole grips do. Now that our 2 clamps are in place, if we just pull the wheel here, look at the amount of slack we've generated, and that's really what we were aiming for. So now you can use a tyre lever. I do have nice strong ones as well, but don't use spoons doing this because you're just going to break them. Pop your tyre levers in place and the tyre should come free very easily. Obviously we're going to remove our clamps once we've done half the tyre. And that's the tyre free of the wheel. From there, simple case of pulling your inner tube out. Enough that you've got space to take the tyre off the other side. Brute force here. Be careful when removing your valve from the rim, but that's us free. It's worth mentioning here that if you are replacing your tube, have a check on the inside of your tyre to make sure there's no thorns or glass stuck in it which could puncture the new tube you put in. There's nothing worse than fixing it and then finding you have to do it again afterwards. Before we refit the tube, I've partially inflated this tube so that it holds a circular shape. That will stop it getting pinched when we put the tyre on. We're also going to make sure that the tyre direction is forwards and that the valve is sitting to the right, which matches with the motor side being on the right of the wheel. You can insert the tube into the tyre. And I like to pull the valve section just clear so that we can put the valve in first and then feed the tube back into the tyre. From here you can press and your tyre should pop back onto your wheel. Now for refitting the tyre, I'm going to press down on one side, again to give us lots of slack at the bottom with this sitting in the valley. Flipping it over, I can then squeeze and get that tyre to go inside. And this is the time where you're going to need your mole grips again. And potentially your pipe grips as well. How's that for recycling? Reuse the zip tie. So starting at my section that's been gripped, I'm going to work my way around using the tyre lever to lever this back into place. Can work on the other side as well. Just get it to fall into place. There we go. Now removing these clips and clamps. Find the tyres back in place. The first step to reinstalling this tyre is going to be popping the valve washer in place. To do that, I'm going to lift the tyre up so you can see what I'm doing. Use your pliers to just pull the valve out of the way very carefully, not to damage it, and you can slot the washer back into its spot. We're now going to go back onto the floor to get the motor back in this wheel. Now that we're back on the floor, we can reinstall the motor. First thing to check is that your valve hole aligns with where your valve is. And then being careful of your fingers, because these magnets are really strong, just drop that into place. There we go. And give it a small press with your hands. It should take you far enough that you can start reinstalling the bolts, which will tighten it up. So I'm going to do that back on the desk. From here, it's just the process in reverse. So I'll get this reassembled now. Simply tighten the bolts up. I like to do these on opposite sides so that this pulls in nice and straight. Hopefully you kept all these bolts in a little magnetic tray or somewhere safe so you know where they all go. I wouldn't tighten these bolts all the way until we've got all of them in place. So I'm going to tighten these bolts in a diamond pattern, starting here and then this one, skip one to this one, and then do the bottom, skipping one each time. These don't need to be super tight. Once those are all done, we can move the wheel back down by the fork. And now we can slot the wheel into the forks. And just tighten this drive side nut to hold it in place. Now I'm going to do the other side. It's a good idea here to put some pressure on the bottom of the wheel to force it up into place. Now ready to tighten the axle nuts. So same as before, we'll pull the plastic away and put our tool on. Just this time we need to hold the wheel in place. I can even do it from the outside to start. But when it comes time to tighten it properly, we're going to go back on the inside so our spanner's got proper attachment to the bolt. Same with the other side. Now that we've tightened the axle nuts, it's time to reinstall the 4 small screws, these are the shorter ones, into the side of the fork. Now if you have an older model, there'll be a few more of these. And these go into the bottom holes here. These don't need to be massively tight, they're just holding this cover onto your fork. And now we can reinstall the fork covers onto the side of the fork. Using some of the longer bolts that we took out earlier. Do the same on the other side, and then you can reinstall your reflective sticker. Once it's all back on, you can then inflate your tyre to the correct PSI. I'm going to do this on the table so you get to see, but don't forget your Xiaomi tyre valve extender into your pump. Once we're at the correct PSI, we can reinstall the valve cap and then go ride. Congratulations. If you've got to this stage, you can now call yourself one of the proud few who can replace a tyre and inner tube on a Xiaomi electric scooter. Replacing the rear tyre once the wheel is out is going to be exactly the same, so you already know how to do that, but let's show you how to remove the rear wheel as well. First we're going to remove the reflectors, and then we'll take off the axle covers. We can now remove the axle bolts, which are a 4mm Allen key, and on this model, which is Pro 2, we're going to need to remove the small posi screwdriver which holds the rear reflector bracket in place. The wheel will now slide out the back of the scooter, and from this point we'd suggest you take the disc off, as it could damage the tyre, the tube, or your hands. Well, I hope this video has been useful to you. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. And finally, see you later.